Welcome to the Tactical Historian. I'm Paul, the self-proclaimed tactical historian, and I'm actually sitting here with Edward Tinker, who's a U.S. Army veteran and has written several volumes on veteran bringbacks, which is a fascinating topic. How many volumes is it now?
I'm up to volume 4.
Wow.
I can't give you the exact year because I forget, but I started volume 1. I just started gathering some stories together. And I published that one, and that was published through Simpson Ltd., Simpson Limited in Galesburg, Illinois. They deal in they're known for Lugers, but they have all kinds of things. And they published volume 1 and volume 2. And then after that, they're okay sellers, but they're not as big a seller. And so volume 3 and 4, I self-published. So I have all of them here. And I also Simpson published Simpson Lugers, which was also the same company that did the bringbacks. And then I did police Lugers with my good friend Dwight Gruber. So I've been published 6 times.
I mean, they are fantastic. What exactly inspired these books?
My history. I love history. I always have. When I was younger, it's funny because I've always liked World War II, although I have kind of a fascination with World War I, but you didn't hear about it as much because of, movies and things like that. I was at a yard sale, and there was a lady there, and her husband had died. And I just happened to ask, when I was a kid, I'm talking about probably 14, 15 to, 17. And I happened to be going by this yard sale, and I asked this lady if she had any swords, guns, or bayonets. You would just kind of ask that. And she says, "Oh, I might downstairs." Well, it turns out that her husband had been in a POW in World War II. And I bought a fork and a spoon that were Nazi symbols on them, and a belt buckle. And although they were brought back by him, and he had been in a POW camp, I've always kind of felt funny about personally owning that stuff. I don't have a problem with them because to me, they were bringback. They were something that that meant something to them, whether it was a release of how they could have something that they had taken from the people that captured them, or the Nazis their uniforms and everything else are really out of there. They're very colorful, lots of bayonets and the knives and stuff. Anyway, it just was fascinating to me, and I gave them away to my brother-in-law, who studied and collected that stuff, and then he got rid of them. Same kind of reason. He felt kind of funny having all this Nazi stuff around. But so I got into Lugers after I retired from the Army. I was in the Army for 20 years, military police, from 80 to 2000, so it's easy to remember. But I got into Lugers, and I probably could have got into Japanese stuff also because I just enjoy the history aspect of it. And but I got into Lugers, and I got real interested in the 1920s and early 30s. This was right after World War I, and it's called the Weimar period. And I got interested in the Simpson Lugers, and Simpson Lugers was actually a company that was Jewish owned. So they're Jewish owned in the 20s. And as the 30s came in, of course, the Nazis said, "Hey, we don't want you owning a gun manufacturing company." And they literally took it away from the Simpson family. But so I find that a fascinating aspect is that, and I've known several Jewish friends that have collected Simpson Lugers simply because of that aspect. And but it's the history part. When I was in the military, my last 7 years, I was actually in the Netherlands. And I had heard of the Netherlands, I'd heard of Holland, but to actually go there and then live there, I was able to go to Bastogne. I was able to go to numerous times, actually. I was able to go to places. Aachen was only 10 miles away, and the Hertigen Forest. So all of that was fascinating to me. Oh, I wonder where I put it. I've got some rounds, empty casings that I found. I was metal detecting before I retired from the military. But bringbacks have always fascinated me. And the thing about bringbacks is that they're sometimes brought back and they were never looked at again. And not that they just weren't into guns or knives. I'm just stuttering. I apologize for that. But it's lot of interesting things of the reasons that people bring back things. Some was they would bring it back and they'd sell it, make some money. Others would capture it. A lot of the stuff that you hear of bringbacks, you know, you always think, oh, the GI picked it up from after a battle. And the reality is that if you're a infantryman, I was military police, so generally I would be in a vehicle. Infantry does just what? They walk along, they trudge, and having 3 or 4 Lugers doesn't seem like much, but each one is about 3 pounds. So most of the guys I've talked to have said that if they did get anything, they might keep one item, but they didn't have just tons of the stuff until probably after the war. And then they were picked up in, you'd see them, they had piles of Japanese rifles and Japanese swords. They had that was of course in the PTO, the Pacific Theater. And in the Eastern Theater, they would have just piles of things and they were destroyed. The GIs could take stuff and they would sign a form and they would get a form signed by an officer. People commonly call that capture papers or bring back paperwork.
Just to clarify for our listeners who might not know the term, so bring back is stuff that veterans are acquiring overseas in places of conflict, and they're actually bringing them back home for like the reasons you mentioned, various reasons, right?
Well, and to expound upon that is that you have to remember that some things are considered stolen. I mean, money, jewelry, things like that. And there's a very fine line of what's picked up and brought back. So it was generally, I don't have any here with me, bring back paperwork. I do, I have a lot of it in my computer, but it had to be signed off, and there was actually military regulations that said what could be brought back and what couldn't. It couldn't be anything that was going to be of scientific interest to the U.S. military or those kind of things. And so it had to be, there was generally limited on what they could bring back and what they couldn't, but it was also kind of open, and there's lots of jokes and true stories about people saying that, you know, Americans, they love their souvenirs. So World War I things were brought back. The Civil War things were brought back. It's very fascinating. In fact, here, let me show you one thing. I don't have any information on it. I bought this a while back. It's a Japanese sword. It's a Wakuza. I'll sound like an idiot, I'm sure, but it's a small one. But the point I'm trying to make is that this was mailed back.
Oh, wow. So, fantastic.
I've seen some collections that people have stuff that are still in the original box, a rifle, a pistol, and it was actually just put into a wood box and shipped home. And there's several people that collect that kind of thing. And so some things, I don't know if that even had to bring back paperwork. It was probably, they changed the rules as the war went along. And that was from the Pacific Theater, obviously.
So just out of curiosity, you know, you mentioned that first story about, you know, going into the basement, that basically like a garage sale, right?
Yeah.
Where else are you finding these treasures that you featured in your books?
Well, most of it, let's see, for volume 1, I had just kind of, well, for all 4 volumes, I put out information on different boards, historical boards, gun boards. There's a lot of collectors. And I think more volume 3 has a lot of Vietnam type items. A friend of mine, I became friends because of the book. His name's Mel, and he specifically collects Vietnam type items. And so I really like to be able to get that. I have lots of World War II items in the 4 volumes. I have a lot of items from Vietnam previously from that. Oh, I have a story about that, by the way, too, with my father-in-law. And then I have actually very little on the Korean War. And it seems kind of funny, it's kind of the forgotten war, but the Korean War, or for that matter, we'll talk about Iraq. The Korean War, you have to remember that there was, I won't get the numbers right, but there was only, what, 50 or 60,000 military that served. It might be not served, but were in the war itself. And I was in Korea for a year in the 80s. So, I mean, I'm sorry, the 90s. Oh, it would be the 80s. It was during the Olympics. I think that was 88. But my point on that, what was interesting is that I met a guy named Mr. Yi. I was a military police, I was physical security. And Mr. Yi, what his job was it was a company Bong Sin, I don't think they're in business anymore. And what they did was they provided guards for the installation. And I was talking to him, and I happened to ask him about the Korean War. I knew he probably wasn't old enough. He said that as a child, that they had to leave Seoul. And Seoul, of course, is a very big city, even back in the 50s. And when they came back, he said everything was just leveled because Seoul was between North Korea and the Chinese, and then, of course, where the Americans were. And Seoul was just, he said it was just totally, completely flat. It was very fascinating and sad.
You know, you brought something up there about the bringbacks, you know, World War II, Vietnam, you know, several different conflicts. Did you notice that, are there more bringbacks from World War II veterans? Are there more bringbacks from Vietnam? Did you notice a discrepancy there, or?
And I guess that's the point I was kind of going toward, and then I got off track, but there were so many more in GIs. And when we say, you know, GIs, I'm talking about Army Air Corps, because it wasn't the Air Force until after the World War II. And then there were Marines and Navy. And I want to say, I could be wrong, I wasn't at like 13 million that were in service at one time. So there were a lot more people who brought items back. I lived in Colorado for 3 or 4 years, and I met a gentleman online who was asking about a Luger. And I went to his house. He was a World War II vet, and he had gotten a Luger it's in volume 1, I believe. And he had gotten this Luger by trading a carton of cigarettes. And that's actually a very common one, or you hear that they got it while playing poker. But his story was that he was actually very much of a pacifist. And I don't have a problem with that in the least. It was just interesting that I asked him about if he'd ever think about selling that, because I thought it'd be nice. I'd made friends with him and his wife, and he didn't want to sell it to me because it was an instrument of war, and he was a pacifist, and he felt that I was a friend. My wife and I were friends, and I thought that was very interesting. And he passed away, and a year or so later, I was talking to his wife, and she said that she would sell it to me, and she did. But the reason was that she had her husband, he had said to her, well, Ed's actually a friend, but he's also a historian and a collector. But it's interesting the different stories you hear from the vet themselves. So you see a lot more World War II items just because of the magnitude of the war and how many sides, you know, I mean, there was the Pacific Theater and of course the European theater, and there are other places. So there's just a lot more weapons. You do see a lot more Vietnam stuff, and it's become very collectible with a lot of people because it's when you did something when you were younger, if you served, then it's more interesting to you.
Were there maybe different regulations that also influenced that as well? Maybe in World War II, I don't know. Maybe it was more commonplace. No one, you know, really hammered them for it. But I wonder today, or, you know, more recent conflicts, if there was more regulations on that kind of stymied that.
No, you are correct. In fact, in World War II, if you look at bring back paperwork from the Pacific Theater or the European theater, they're totally different. And it's because they knew items were going to bring back, and the Army, Navy, Marines, they all have regulations that talk about bringing captured items and what could be brought back. For World War II, you see a lot of it. Korean War, less, but I believe that's simply because of less people that were there. And then Vietnam. Then as you start getting and you start talking about Iraq or Afghanistan, I was over in Iraq in 2009, 2010 timeframe. I was over there for about 8 or 9 months as a police instructor. And I couldn't bring back anything. You couldn't bring back a helmet. You couldn't bring back a bayonet. And most of that had already been picked up or destroyed sometime before that, you know, because the fighting was much more intense in 2006 for our troops that were over there, you know.
Just out of curiosity, I know we were talking about sort of bringing back examples of what the enemy carried as sort of souvenirs. Are bringbacks also related to maybe trading with allies? Maybe you know, go overseas, trade patches with someone from the British military. Would that be considered a bringback still, or?
Absolutely. In fact, if you talk about U.S. weapons, generally they can't be brought back. But there are examples in my books and other people that I've met that they were able to bring back a 45 or an M16. And I say M16 because it would have been fully automatic and a single shot, one shot at a time. And so if they own it now, it was a long time ago, was registered, and there's a tax from the U.S. Government. But yeah, a lot of, besides guns or weapons like that, there's lots of things that are traded. There's hats and like you said, patches. Because anything that's always different. I've traded for patches and stuff when I worked with other people, because it wasn't common. When I was in the Netherlands, we had some Russian delegation that came, and one of the guys was I think he was probably the equivalent of a major or a lieutenant colonel, and him and I traded patches, and he was very surprised to find an enlisted guy who had a bachelor's degree. He said, if you were in Bulgaria, you would be an officer. And I said, well, it's a lot of Americans have degrees. So he was very surprised by that. Very nice people. So, but yeah, if you have a chance to trade, you do.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna add mine to. But first of all, I had the similar thing where people said, "Oh, you have your degree, you should be an officer too." And I always told them I prefer to work. I like working. So, but one thing I also say, when I actually had the chance to go train in Australia, that was one thing we all traded hats, because we had the patrol caps and they had the I guess the bush hat or whatever. And I remember at some point the Australians got in trouble by their sergeant major because they had formed up and everyone was wearing an American patrol cap. No one had their own regulation hat. So it's even popular today, I would say, to trade things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Did you notice if there was a particular branch that collected more than the other, or do you think it's pretty much spread? Like, did you see Navy sailors collecting more than Army guys, or was there a difference?
Well, there were a lot. Probably the most of it would be the Army, because the Army Air Corps. So it was a lot more. There were a lot more people. The Marines have always traditionally been smaller, and of course, then the Navy. Some of them, of course, medics are assigned to a Marine unit. But yeah, there'd be probably a lot more Army. But then also the occupation after the war, a lot of items were from, you'll see their capture papers from 46 or 47 or 1948, and they'll have bringing back items. A lot of stuff was destroyed, but things could still be brought back, and you'll see it. They may have been stationed there in somewhere in Japan in 1946, and there would still be items laying around.
You mentioned a little bit before, but what were some of the most popular bringbacks, would you say? I mean, was it mostly firearms, or what do you really get a sense of?
What's interesting is a lot of times, I would say pistols, because they're smaller, easier to carry, but you see a lot of rifles that are brought back. There's a term they use of duffel cuts, because to make it fit inside their duffel bag, they would cut it down the wood, because if you look at the older rifles, the stock goes almost the whole way, and so it would be hanging out of their duffel bag. And so you see a lot of that. I would say pistols and patches and things like that were very popular with people. In the books, I see a lot of pistols, but I also think I'm prejudiced in the sense that the groups and areas I went to, I like to collect pistols the most. They take up less room, and they're interesting to me, older ones.
What would you say that these pistols that you collect and have seen, what do they tell us about the guys who carried them and the guys who actually captured them as trophies or took them as trophies? What sort of story do they tell?
Well, as an example, I bought a Luger, and it also had a holster with it. And on the holster, many times you'll find a GI's name written on the front flap or on the back of it, which some people will say that lessens the value because it's been scratched in. I find it fascinating. And one guy had written quite a few things on the back, and his serial number, it's not a Social Security, but it was the Army serial number. And I looked it up, and he was actually with the P-38s, which is not the pistol or the tool you use to open up food, but it was that kind of a weird double planed tail with the two tails on a plane. And they were, I think they had a name to them, Night Riders or something like that. It was fascinating. And you could read kind of a story by looking up the person. Most of the time, you're never sure if an item was brought back from World War I or World War II, or if it was sold and brought back or sent over here in the 50s or 60s. So we always say, don't believe the story, believe what the gun is itself. Don't buy this, there's those things that we all say. But a lot of items, you're never quite sure unless somebody truly tells you that they brought it back. And then if you don't have any proof, once a generation goes by, it becomes just another gun laying around or hat or whatever.
I was going to say that's one of the big things in the collecting community, I think, is to get that provenance, that big paperwork that comes with it, which is something we all look for.
Exactly. Yeah.
Are there also some other items you'd like to share with us that are from your book, some that you'd like to highlight?
Well, not really, but I wanted to show you one thing. These are, don't see it very well, I know, but it's small and it's a little plain and it's made out of probably a 50 caliber. And then the rest of it is it's all brass. And GIs would make this kind of thing. And I would imagine by the looks of it that this was a World War II one. Same with this one, which is much larger. But you can see that they're made out of parts because if you're an infantry guy, you don't have really the time. You might be back in that's not true. You might be back in the rear for 3 or 4 weeks while they were getting new supplies and more troops assigned to you because of people being hurt or killed. But a lot of times there's people who are supply or, JAG, or the war was over with and they had free time while they're waiting to be shipped to Japan, because that's what they thought after the European theater ended. And after World War I, there was also they did hospitals and people would make things like this. This is obviously a World War II example, but you find a lot of items with German coins or British coins. The belt buckles are common. You'd see those. I also have matchbox covers. They were very common after World War I, but I started a book on trench art. I didn't even say what they're called. They're called trench art. And I started a book on it and I had about 90 pages, 83 pages to be exact. And there's no real story. It was going to be more of just you'd glance through it. So, and maybe whatever I wrote about it. And I eventually got away from doing it because it costs a lot of money to, not a huge amount, but it costs you about $5,000 or $6,000 to publish a couple hundred books. And I thought, well, it'd be interesting, but it's very hard to make money off of selling books. So I decided not to do the trench art book, but I still collect them myself.
Oh man, I got excited. I was hoping that you would have followed through with that one. It's funny you mentioned
I'll email you a PDF of it.
Oh, thank you. I was gonna say actually right here. Speaking of trench art, here's a candelabra. You can't really see it on camera, but it's
I can.
Civil War bayonets.
That is really cool. Oh, I would have bought that.
Yeah, I found it in local antique store here in New York. But it is really interesting trench art, and I've seen ashtrays that are made with shell casing and I think another lamps. My grandfather, when he came back from World War II, had a bunch of shells. He was in the Army Air Corps. I don't know how he found these artillery shells, but he had them made into lamps. So it's really interesting.
That is cool. Yeah. I've seen pictures where there are, a huge pile. We're talking about, 40 feet tall probably. And it's just artillery shells. So I'm sure that if a GI walked up and grabbed some, who would care? And after the war, a lot of the vehicles and stuff couldn't come back to America. That was part of the deal for the Lend-Lease type stuff. And so a lot of items were reused, brass, of course, because that's what all the shell casings are made out of, the vast majority. But it's fascinating. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of the things I would also tell people too, something I've gotten into, because I know that the trench art and also the veteran bringbacks can get a little expensive for the beginning collectors like myself. So I oftentimes like to collect the original photographs, original pictures that were taken of soldiers carrying bringbacks.
Yes. Yes.
So those, I find that those are pretty popular as well, where you have a American soldier wearing his, captured German helmet, or wearing a captured German Iron Cross or something like that. It could be really interesting as well. So
yeah, and I've seen those pictures. There's a few that are always shared, and I think earlier I had talked about the weapons being destroyed because the Army would come in, and this is where GIs would grab an item, and that's one thing that's always interesting about, people. A lot of Lugers don't have a matching magazine with the same 4-digit serial number or whatever was on it. And one reason that I've been told by actual veterans is they said that the Germans would, they'd come along and they would they'd drop their magazine into a 50-gallon barrel. They'd drop the pistol in, and they'd drop the holster onto either a pile or whatever. So the items were placed in 3 different. That Luger that I had from my friend, the holster, although it was a police holster, was for a totally different gun. And that happened because they got separated like that. Right. Because more so with a police gun, they're more likely to be together, because a police officer in Germany, and we realize some went with the German army a lot, and but they would not get separated like that compared to an army guy who's fighting in the trenches in World War I or in World War II, where they're fighting and their magazine jams, and they just toss it out and they get a new magazine that has a totally different number.
Right. Well, I know that you do have to run, so I can't take all of your time. But we'll have to definitely do this again, because this is a lot of fun, and I know I'm only scratching the surface here. So I'll probably have to bug you again on Facebook. Before I let you go, I've got 2 more things to ask. Firstly, how can people purchase your books?
Simpson Limited has Simpson Lugers, and they have volume 1 and volume 2. I have all 4 volumes here at my house. You can put out my email because it's everywhere. It's in my books. ed_tinker@hotmail.com. They're generally about $25 a piece. If you buy 2 of them, I generally take about $5 off. And that's all of it. I have them, and so does Simpson, and a few other book people that I've sent them to. So you'll find them at a gun show sometimes.
Fantastic. And of course, the last question, something I like to do is, people who are potential listeners, friends of the show, they get to submit their questions as well. And I don't know if you have an answer for this, but they brought up, I believe it's Band of Brothers, where one of the guys captures a Luger, I think it is.
Yes,
and he shoots himself in the leg. Did that happen? Is that a common occurrence? What happened there? Maybe
I believe from the book, Band of Brothers, and it was done by what's his name? He was a real good writer, and then Major Winters also had talked to a lot of people. But yeah, the problem with, you'll hear that about Japanese pistols. They'll talk about it's called the Type 94, which is that really weird looking one, and people will say, oh, it was done. It has an exposed sear, and if you push it, it'll go click. Well, Lugers have one that's not as exposed. But the point is that when you're in basic training and then you go to your advanced training, if you're going to be around guns, they teach you about gun safety. But when you have a different gun, and in wartime, people get shot and hurt. My son was over in Iraq, and him and his friend, and they were playing with knives or something, as GIs do, and he cut his hand really bad, and bad enough he had a little bit loss of some of his feeling and such. So the point is that people who are not familiar with stuff can very easily hurt themselves. So
all right, yeah. So there you go. Definitely, if you're going to be collecting these things, read up on the safety stuff as well. Always very important.
Yeah,
safety.
Absolutely. Every gun's loaded, even if it's not.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Good to see you. You take care now.